The crash and the mysterious plea. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of golden sand beneath the twin suns of Velora Prime. The heat shimmered in the air, turning the landscape into a living mirage. The only sign of life was a single wrecked starship, half buried in the dunes, smoke rising from its shattered engines. Inside the broken ship, Ethan Carter groaned as he pushed himself up from the wreckage. His body ached, his pilot suit torn and burned in places. His ship, the Nomad, was a lost cause. The ambush had been fast. No warning, no escape. He had barely managed to steer the ship down before the thrusters died completely. Ethan wiped the sweat from his face and scanned the horizon. No signs of his attackers. But that didn't mean they weren't watching. His instincts screamed danger. "Great," he muttered. Stranded on a furnace with no water, no comms, and probably some angry aliens looking to finish the job. Then something crackled in his earpiece. A weak, desperate voice. Please, is anyone there?" Ethan's body stiffened. He adjusted his communicator, clearing the static. "Who is this?" he asked. Silence. Then, a soft, trembling whisper. "They're coming for me. I don't want to die." Ethan frowned. The voice belonged to a young girl, her fear bleeding through the transmission. "Where are you?" he asked. A set of coordinates blinked onto his wrist display. 3 miles north. Not far. "Hold tight, kid," Ethan said, adjusting his gear. "I'm coming." The desert was brutal. Every step sank his boots into scorching sand. His throat was dry, and the heat waves blurred his vision. But he pushed forward. The wreckage of an ancient fortress rose in the distance, half consumed by the shifting dunes. It was old, rusted towers, crumbling stone, and shadows that whispered secrets. Ethan moved carefully, gripping his blaster. Then he heard it. A low guttural growl. His pulse spiked. He turned slowly and froze. A sand reaper. The creature was massive, its insect-like body blending into the sand. Its long, scythe-like limbs twitched, and its multi-eyed face locked onto him. Ethan didn't move. Reapers hunted by vibration. One wrong step, and it would be over. Then, the communicator beeped. The sound was small, but it was enough. The reaper screeched, lunging forward, its razor-sharp limbs slicing through the air. Ethan rolled sideways, the blade barely missing him. He fired his blaster, 3 shots to the head. The creature roared but didn't go down. Of course, that would be too easy, Ethan muttered. The reaper struck again. Ethan dodged, grabbing a small explosive charge from his belt. "Eat this." He threw it. Direct hit to the mouth. The creature lunged, but before it could reach him, boom! The explosion sent sand flying. The reaper collapsed, twitching, then fell still. Ethan let out a breath. One problem down. Then he heard it, a scream from inside the fortress. He sprinted inside, his boots kicking up dust. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay. Broken metal, shattered stone, and chains clinking somewhere deep in the shadows. He followed the sound, heart pounding. The scream had been real. Someone was in trouble. At the end of the hallway, he saw her, a young alien girl locked inside a cage. Her pale blue skin was covered in bruises, her silver hair tangled and dirty. Her eyes, glowing violet, filled with fear as she clutched the bars. Ethan stepped closer, but before he could speak, a voice boomed from the shadows. Well, what do we have here?" Ethan turned sharply, his blaster ready. 3 figures stepped out of the darkness. Bounty hunters. They were tall, armored, and heavily armed. The leader, a reptilian brute with a scar running across his scaled face, grinned, revealing sharp teeth. "You must be the human who survived the crash," the leader said. "Impressive, but this is as far as you go." Ethan glanced at the girl. She shook her head, silently pleading. The bounty hunters moved in, weapons raised. Ethan smirked. "Oh, boys." He tightened his grip on his blaster. "You have no idea what kind of trouble you just walked into. Rescuing the last hope." The fortress was deathly silent except for the distant sound of chains clinking in the dark. The air smelled of rust, decay, and something worse. Fear. Ethan Carter stood still, his blaster aimed at the bounty hunters blocking his way. The alien girl in the cage behind them clutched the bars, her violet eyes wide with terror. Ethan didn't know who she was. He didn't know why she was locked up or why these Exarithian hunters were guarding her. But one thing was clear. She needed help, and they wanted her dead. The leader of the bounty hunters, a towering reptilian brute with gray scales, sneered. His black eyes gleamed as he sized Ethan up. "You should have stayed in the desert, human," the reptile growled. His voice was low, like a snake coiling before a strike. "This girl is property of the Exarithian warlords." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? I didn't know slavery was back in style." The bounty hunters tensed, their hands twitching toward their weapons. The leader grinned. "She's no slave," he said. "She's a problem that needs to be erased. You don't understand what you're interfering with." Ethan shrugged. "That's funny, because I don't really care." Then he moved, faster than they expected. His blaster fired, hitting the first bounty hunter in the chest, a direct kill. Before the others could react, he dove sideways, rolling into cover behind a rusted metal crate. Blaster fire erupted. Energy bolts sizzled through the air, striking the walls, sending sparks flying. Ethan peeked out, fired 3 quick shots. Another hunter went down, smoke rising from the hole in his helmet. The leader snarled, pulling out a shock whip. The electrified weapon cracked against the stone floor as he stepped closer. Ethan clenched his jaw. He hated whips. The bounty hunter lashed out. A flash of blue energy. Ethan barely dodged, rolling aside as the whip sliced through the air where his head had been. He needed an opening. His eyes flicked to the cage behind them. The girl was still frozen in fear, but her hands were gripping the bars. She was waiting. Ethan made a split-second decision. He grabbed a throwing knife from his belt and launched it, not at the bounty hunter, but at the cage lock. The blade struck dead center. The lock shattered. The cage door swung open. For a moment, the girl didn't move. Then, she did something Ethan didn't expect. She reached out her hand, and the air around her shimmered. A pulse of energy exploded from her palm, invisible, powerful, raw. The bounty hunter leader was thrown backward as if hit by an unseen force. He slammed into the wall with a sickening crack. His shock whip short-circuited, sparks flying. Ethan stared at the girl, stunned. "What was that?" he muttered. The girl swayed, gripping the edge of the cage for balance. Her breath was shaky. "I don't know," she whispered. Ethan shook off his surprise. No time for questions. He grabbed her hand. "Come on, princess. We're leaving." She hesitated, then nodded. The two of them bolted through the fortress, weaving through crumbling corridors and broken hallways. More bounty hunters were coming. He could hear the heavy footsteps, the static of their comms. They weren't getting out of here without a fight. The escape through the ruins. The fortress was a maze of stone and metal, half swallowed by the shifting sands of Velora Prime. Ethan led the way, his grip firm on the girl's wrist, as they sprinted through the ruins. "Do you have a name?" he asked between breaths. "Syra," she answered. "All right, Syra, do me a favor. Try not to pass out." She didn't answer, but he could feel her trembling. Whatever power she had used back there had drained her. She wouldn't last long like this. Behind them, the bounty hunters were closing in. They rounded a corner, dead end. A massive metal door blocked their way, rusted shut, half buried in sand. Ethan cursed. Of course. Syra touched the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the rust faded. The metal glowed faintly. The door unlocked itself. Ethan gaped at her. How? No time, she panted. Fair enough. They shoved through the door, stepping into a wide-open chamber. Ancient ships and abandoned hovercrafts were scattered everywhere, a scrapyard of forgotten technology. Ethan's heart leaped. He spotted an old desert runner speeder half buried in the sand. Their ticket out of here. He rushed over, tearing off the dust-covered panel. The controls were ancient but functional. He started pressing buttons, bypassing old security locks. Behind him, blaster fire erupted. Zaira ducked behind a broken engine as bounty hunters stormed into the chamber. "Carter, get this thing working," she shouted. Almost there. A bounty hunter took aim at Tyra. Ethan grabbed his pistol and fired without looking. The hunter dropped. Then, the speeder roared to life. "Get in." Zaira jumped into the seat beside him. Ethan slammed the throttle forward. The speeder lurched, kicking up a storm of sand as they shot forward, blasting through the chamber, barreling toward a half-open hangar gate. Bounty hunters poured in, firing wildly. Ethan gritted his teeth. "Hold on." He jammed the accelerator. The speeder hit the ramp at full speed. And then they were airborne. Into the unknown. The speeder soared out of the fortress, landing hard on the shifting dunes outside. Ethan barely kept control, swerving wildly. The bounty hunters weren't far behind. Hoverbikes and skiffs shot out of the fortress, kicking up trails of sand. Zaira turned to him, panicked. "They won't stop," she said. Ethan grinned. "They never do." He reached for the speeder's control panel, flipping a switch. The engines flared, leaving a trail of ignited plasma in their wake. The pursuing hunters rode straight into the burning sandstorm. Explosions lit up the desert. Ethan whooped. "I love this job." Zaira, breathless, watched as the fortress disappeared behind them. "Where are we going?" she asked. Ethan exhaled. "Somewhere safe." She hesitated. "Is there such a place?" Ethan glanced at her. "Not for people like us." But that wouldn't stop him from trying. The chase across the Westlands. The twin suns of Velora Prime hung low on the horizon, bleeding red and gold across the endless desert. The wind howled, whipping sand through the air like shards of glass. Ethan Carter gripped the controls of the speeder, his jaw tight, as he pushed the old machine to its limits. Behind them, a small army of bounty hunters was in pursuit. Hoverbikes, attack skiffs, and dune crawlers rumbled over the shifting sands, kicking up massive clouds of dust. They were gaining fast. Zaira sat beside him, gripping the dashboard, her violet eyes scanning the landscape. She looked exhausted. Her strange energy burst back at the fortress had drained her. Her breathing was unsteady, her skin paler than before. Ethan flicked a switch, boosting the speeder's thrusters. The engine roared, flames spewing from the exhaust as the vehicle lurched forward, skimming across the dunes. "We're not gonna outrun them forever," he muttered. Zaira's gaze flickered toward him. "Then what do we do?" Ethan exhaled sharply. "We fight." A blaster bolt sizzled past his head, striking the sand beside them. "Correction," he muttered. "We fight now." A fight at full speed. The bounty hunters closed in, their weapons lighting up the twilight sky. Ethan swerved hard to the right, barely dodging a missile that exploded behind them, sending a wave of fire and sand into the air. Zaira ducked, covering her head. "This is insane." "Welcome to my life," Ethan shot back. A hoverbike pulled up alongside them. The rider, a heavily armored alien with a cybernetic eye, raising a rifle. Ethan didn't hesitate. He let go of the steering wheel for half a second, pulled his blaster and fired. One shot, straight through the visor. The hunter tumbled off the bike, his body rolling across the dunes. Zaira's eyes widened. "You didn't even aim." Ethan smirked. "I don't need to." Another skiff pulled up beside them, loaded with hunters. One of them leaped onto the speeder, landing on the backseat with a vicious snarl. Zaira screamed as the massive alien warrior lunged for her. Ethan kicked the speeder into a hard spin, the vehicle sliding sideways across the sand. The sudden motion threw the attacker off balance, just long enough for Ethan to slam an elbow into his gut, grab his collar, and toss him over the side. The bounty hunter hit the sand and was swallowed by the dust storm behind them. Zyra was panting, eyes wide. "You're insane." Ethan grinned. "I get that a lot." The canyon trap. Ethan's tactical mind was already scanning for an escape route. Outrunning them was impossible. Fighting them head-on was suicide. Then he spotted something in the distance, a narrow canyon carved into the rocky cliffs. That was it. He pushed the speeder to max throttle, heading straight for the canyon. Zyra's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" "That's a dead end. Trust me." The bounty hunters followed, not realizing the trap Ethan was setting. The speeder shot into the canyon, twisting through the jagged rock formations. The hunters were forced to tighten their formation, funneled into a single-file chase. Ethan activated his wrist controls, pulling up an old detonator sequence. "Hold on tight, princess." Zyra barely had time to react before Ethan pressed the trigger. A wall of fire. The canyon erupted behind them. Ethan had planted old explosives in the ruins long before the fight even started, just in case he ever needed a quick escape. The shockwave sent chunks of rock tumbling down, collapsing the canyon entrance, sealing off most of their pursuers. The few hunters that made it through were now trapped with them. Except now, they were down to just a handful. Ethan slowed the speeder. He and Sarah hopped out onto the sand. The remaining bounty hunters skidded to a stop in front of them, realizing they had walked right into an ambush. Ethan cracked his knuckles. "All right," he said. "Let's finish this." The final showdown. The leader of the bounty hunters stepped forward. A 7-foot-tall warrior, clad in black battle armor, his helmet reflecting the twin suns. His name was Vorak the Relentless, one of the Exarathian warlord's deadliest enforcers. He smiled, revealing jagged teeth. "You're a fool, human," Vorak said, stepping closer. "You think you can stand against us?" Ethan tilted his head. "Yeah, pretty much." Vorak growled. "Kill them." The hunters charge. Blades flashed, blasters fired. Ethan moved like a ghost in the storm, dodging attacks, countering with brutal efficiency. One punch to the throat, a spin kick to the ribs, a stolen knife plunged into an enemy's leg. Zyra, weakened but determined, ducked under an attack and used her mysterious power again. This time, a shockwave that sent 2 hunters flying. Ethan grabbed a fallen energy spear, spinning it before impaling the last enemy standing. Silence. The only ones left standing were him and Tyra. Vorak was breathing heavily, his armor dented, his weapons depleted. He looked at Ethan, hatred burning in his black eyes. "This isn't over," Vorak growled. Ethan wiped blood from his lip. Yeah, you bad guys always say that." Then, before Vorak could react, Ethan grabbed a grenade from the dead hunter's belt, pulled the pin, and shoved it into Vorak's armor. The warlord's eyes widened. Boom! Vorak was sent flying, his armor shredded, his body vanishing into the sandstorm. Ethan exhaled, rolling his shoulders. That was fun. Zyra stared at him. "You're completely insane." Ethan grinned. "You're just now figuring that out." The truth revealed. The desert was quiet again. Ethan and Sarah climbed back onto the speeder, the last traces of fire and destruction fading behind them. Zyra turned to him, her voice hesitant. "I should tell you the truth." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I figured you were holding back." She swallowed hard. "I'm not just a runaway. I'm not just any princess." He waited. Zyra took a deep breath. "I'm the last of the Solari, the rightful heir to an empire lost to time." Ethan's expression didn't change. "Great," he muttered. "That means more people are gonna try to kill me, doesn't it?" Zyra's face turned serious. Not just people, she whispered. The entire Exarathian Empire. The wind howled around them, as Ethan realized just how deep he was in this mess. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he'd make it out alive. The betrayal in the dark. The desert night was a different kind of danger. The heat of the twin suns had faded, replaced by a cold, biting wind that howled across the wasteland. The sky above was vast and endless, filled with alien constellations that shimmered like distant ghosts. Ethan Carter kept one hand on the speeder's control, the other resting near his blaster. Beside him, Syra sat in silence, her silver hair catching the soft glow of the stars. She was still weak from her earlier use of power. Every now and then, her violet eyes fluttered closed, only to snap open again, as if she were fighting against sleep. She had just dropped the biggest bombshell of the night. She wasn't just a runaway. She was the last of the Solari, the rightful heir to an empire lost to time. That meant the Exarathian warlords weren't just chasing them to kill her. They wanted her alive. They wanted her power. Ethan exhaled, scanning the horizon. "Well, princess," he muttered, "if I'd known I was signing up to be the babysitter of a galactic heir, I might have charged more." Kazera gave him a weak smile. "Would you really have taken the job?" Ethan smirked. "No, but I might have run a little faster in the other direction." She laughed softly, the first time since they met. But then her laughter faded, and she winced, pressing a hand to her temple. Ethan frowned. "Hey, you good?" She nodded, but he didn't buy it. She looked worse than before, her breathing shallow, her fingers trembling slightly. "You used too much energy back there," Ethan said. "You need rest." Zyra sighed. "I know." They rode in silence for a while, until Ethan spotted something in the distance, a rocky canyon, the entrance half hidden by sand dunes. He pointed. "There, we'll stop for the night." The hidden cave. The entrance was barely wide enough for the speeder, but Ethan maneuvered it through, finding a small, sheltered cavern tucked between the cliffs. It wasn't much, but it would keep them hidden. He parked the speeder and jumped off, scanning the area with his blaster drawn. No movement, no signs of life. For now, they were safe. Sarah climbed out and immediately stumbled. Ethan caught her before she could hit the ground. "Whoa, okay, that's it," he said. "You're running on fumes. Sit down." She reluctantly obeyed, lowering herself onto a smooth rock near the cave wall. Ethan dug through his bag and tossed her a water canister. She drank deeply, her hands still trembling. Ethan crouched down in front of her. "You're not just tired. What's going on?" Zyra hesitated. I think my powers are changing. They used to be weaker. Now, every time I use them, it feels like." She paused, searching for the right words. "Like what?" She met his gaze. "Like something inside me is waking up." Ethan didn't like the sound of that. He had seen a lot of strange things in the galaxy, but power that changed on its own. That was a whole new level of dangerous. Before he could respond, a voice echoed from the shadows. "Then you must be careful, little one." Ethan spun around, blaster raised. A figure stepped out of the darkness. The stranger in the shadows. The man was tall and cloaked in dark robes, his face hidden beneath a hood. His boots barely made a sound as he approached. Despite the shadows, his golden eyes gleamed like a predator's. Ethan didn't lower his weapon. "Who the hell are you?" The stranger raised his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "A traveler. Like you." Syra, still weak, squinted at him. "You? You're Solari." Ethan tensed. "Another Solari." The man nodded. "My name is Cal. I have been searching for you, Princess Tyra." Ethan did not like this. Too convenient. Too well-timed. Syra, on the other hand, looked relieved. "You know who I am?" she asked. Cale gave a slow nod. "More than you know." He turned to Ethan. "And you. I know who you are as well. Ethan Carter." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Oh yeah. What do you know?" Kale smiled slightly. That you're a survivor, that you do not trust easily, and that you will need to, if you wish to keep her safe. Ethan scowled. That's real cute, but forgive me if I don't immediately trust the mysterious guy who just walked out of the dark. Kale sighed. I understand your hesitation, but I come with information that may save your lives. Syra leaned forward. What information? Cal's expression darkened. The Exarathian warlords know exactly where you are. They are coming. The betrayal. Ethan reacted immediately. He grabbed Syra's arm and pulled her up. Then we're leaving. Kale shook his head. No, you don't understand. Ethan had heard enough. He turned back toward the speeder, and then he stopped. A faint beeping noise echoed from the ground. Ethan's blood ran cold. A tracking beacon. It was blinking softly beneath the speeder, planted there while they were distracted. Ethan's eyes snapped to Kale. You son of a... Before he could draw his weapon, Kale moved faster than any human should be able to. A shockwave of force blasted Ethan backward, slamming him into the cave wall. His vision blurred, stars bursting behind his eyes. Syra screamed. Kale grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the cave entrance. Ethan struggled to his feet, but his body felt like it had been hit by a freight ship. Kale glanced back, his golden eyes flashing. I'm sorry, he said, but she belongs with us. Then he vanished into the night, taking Syra with him. Ethan roared in frustration, staggering forward. But before he could chase them, a deafening roar echoed through the canyon. A warship was descending from the sky. The Exarathians were here, and Ethan was alone. The burning battlefield. Alone in the wasteland. Ethan Carter was on his knees, blood trickling down his temple, his body aching from the brutal force of Cal's attack. His head throbbed, his vision swam, but he forced himself to focus. Above him, the Exarathian warship loomed like a black monolith in the night sky, its thrusters sending gusts of hot air and sand into the canyon. The red glow of its engines painted the rocky walls in firelight, giving the illusion that the world around him was burning. And in a way it was. Syra was gone. Taken. The distant muffled screams of the princess still echoed in his ears, ringing louder than the roaring engines of the warship. He clenched his fists, pushing himself up from the sand. Kale had betrayed them. The man who had spoken of helping them, of guiding Syra to safety, had sold her out to the very warlords who wanted her enslaved or dead. Ethan gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He could still hear the warship's boarding ramp closing, the Exarathians preparing for departure. He had one chance, one last shot to stop them. His blaster was gone, buried somewhere in the sand. His speeder was wrecked. He had no backup, no weapons, nothing. But he still had himself, and that had always been enough. A one-man assault. Ethan sprinted toward the warship, his boots digging into the shifting sand. His muscles screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain. The ship was already lifting off, its landing thrusters firing up. The wind howled, making every step feel like running through a storm. But then, he spotted it, a grappling hook launcher left behind near one of the fallen Exarathian warriors. Ethan didn't hesitate. He snatched the weapon from the sand, spun, aimed, and fired. The hook shot forward, its magnetic clasps latching onto the ship's undercarriage. Before he could second-guess himself, Ethan activated the winch and was yanked into the air. The desert disappeared beneath him as he shot upward, the howling wind rushing past his ears. He slammed into the metal hull of the ship, gripping the cable tight as the warship rumbled, rising higher into the sky. His fingers burned, the heat from the ship's engines making it almost unbearable to hold on. But Ethan gritted his teeth and climbed, inch by inch, hauling himself toward an open maintenance hatch near the rear of the ship. Blaster fire erupted from above. The Exarathian guards had spotted him, fighting in the skies. Ethan twisted midair, barely dodging a blaster shot that sizzled past his shoulder. He swung on the cable, using his momentum to launch himself toward the hatch. His boots slammed into the nearest guard, sending the alien soldier toppling backward into the ship's interior. Before the others could react, Ethan ripped a blaster rifle from the fallen guard's hands and opened fire. 2 shots. 2 more Exarathians dropped. The last one charged him, drawing a curved energy blade. Ethan had no time to think. He stepped forward, twisting his body at the last second, dodging the blade by an inch. He grabbed the alien's wrist, twisting it hard enough to make the warrior grunt in pain, then drove his knee into the guard's stomach. The Exarathian doubled over, and Ethan finished it with a brutal elbow to the face. The alien collapsed. Ethan stood there, breathing heavily, his blaster raised. The ship had stabilized in the air, flying toward the Exarathian stronghold on the other side of the wasteland. He had minutes before they reached their destination. He had to find Syra. The prison deck. Moving through the warship was like walking through the belly of a beast. The hallways were dimly lit, filled with red warning lights flashing along the walls. The air smelled of engine oil, sweat, and metal. Ethan stayed low, gripping his stolen blaster as he silently took down any guards in his path. Then he found the holding cells. Rows of energy cages lined the walls, but only one was occupied. Syra sat inside, her wrists bound with energy restraints, her silver hair falling over her face. Ethan didn't call out to her. He could see that she wasn't alone. Standing in front of the cell, watching her, was Kale, the traitor. Ethan's pulse spiked. He stepped forward, raising his blaster. "Turn around, Kale." Kale did, slowly. His golden eyes glowed in the dim light, his expression unreadable. "You made it aboard," he said, almost impressed. Ethan didn't lower the weapon. "Open the cell." "Now." Kale sighed, as if disappointed. "You don't understand, Ethan. I did this to protect her." Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. "That's funny, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you sold her out." Kale didn't flinch. "If I hadn't handed her over, they would have sent an entire fleet. This way, I can bargain for her survival." Ethan's voice was deadly calm. "Her survival? They're going to rip her apart." Kale shook his head. "They need her alive. They know what she is. They know that the Solari are not extinct." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Kale's face darkened. "She is more than just a lost princess," he said. "She is the key to the Celestial Gate." Ethan frowned. "What the hell is that?" Before Cal could answer, the ship lurched violently. An alarm blared overhead. "Impact detected. Incoming fire." Ethan's heart leaped. Someone was attacking the warship. Cal's eyes widened. "They're here sooner than I expected." Ethan didn't waste a second. He shot the control panel, overloading the energy locks on Syra's cage. The cell door snapped open, and she collapsed forward. Ethan caught her before she hit the ground. "Can you move?" he asked. Syra nodded weakly. "Why, yeah." He turned back to Kale, his blaster still raised. "You're out of options," Ethan said. Kale gave him a knowing smile. "No, Ethan. We all are." And then, the ceiling exploded. The warship shook violently as a new force entered the battle. A fleet of unknown ships was attacking. Ethan shielded Syra with his body as debris rained down, alarms screaming all around them. Kale stood still, his face unreadable. "This is just the beginning," Kale said quietly. Ethan didn't know who was attacking. He didn't know what Kale's game was, but one thing was clear. They weren't getting off this ship without a fight. The city of Solari, and the final truth. Rising from the ashes, the warship's metal husk was still smoking when Ethan and Syra stumbled away from the wreckage, battered and burned but alive. The unknown attackers had crippled the ship just as Ethan managed to escape with Syra. He didn't know who they were, nor did he care at that moment. All that mattered was that they'd bought him a chance to keep moving. They crossed the scorched sands in silence, Kyra leaning heavily on him for support. She was pale, her usually bright violet eyes dimmed by exhaustion and pain. Ethan could feel the heat radiating from her skin. Not the fever of sickness, but something deeper, something unnatural. "Hey," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just a little further." "Hang on." She didn't answer, but her grip on his arm tightened. The landscape began to change. The rolling dunes gave way to cracked, rocky terrain. Dark spires of jagged stone jutted from the ground like the teeth of some ancient beast. The wind howled through the formations, carrying a faint, almost musical hum. In the distance, Ethan saw a shimmer of light. An oasis, or what looked like one. The city of Solari. He had no idea what to expect. Zyra had mentioned it in passing, but there had been no time for details. All he knew was that it was the one place she thought she might be safe. But safe from what? From who? Ethan's mind raced as they climbed the last ridge. The city came into view, and his breath caught. A lost city beneath the sand. Solari wasn't like any settlement Ethan had ever seen. It was both ancient and alive, a sprawling metropolis half buried beneath the desert sands. Towers of crystalline structures rose high into the sky, their surfaces glowing faintly with an internal light. Roads carved from white stone snaked through the city, reflecting the starlight above. But the most striking feature was the massive domed structure at the city's heart. It shone like a second moon, its surface etched with countless glowing runes. Ethan could feel the power radiating from it, even at this distance. "What is this place?" he muttered. Zyra finally spoke, her voice weak but steady. "Home," she said. "The last home of my people." Ethan glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Your people built this." She nodded. "A long time ago. Before the wars. Before everything fell apart." Ethan wanted to ask more, but he didn't get the chance. As they approached the city's edge, figures emerged from the shadows, silent and cloaked, their faces hidden behind masks carved from a translucent, glowing crystal. Ethan's hand went to his blaster. "Don't," Zyra said quietly. "They're the Guardians." The figures stopped a few paces away, their heads tilting slightly as if studying him. Then one of them stepped forward and spoke, their voice a strange harmony of tones. "You bring the heir," they said. "You are welcome here, outsider. But tread carefully. The sands of Solari do not forgive trespassers." Ethan didn't lower his guard, but he relaxed slightly. "Fine by me. I'm just here to make sure she's safe." The Guardians exchanged glances, then motioned for him to follow. The heart of the city. They led Ethan and Zyra through the winding streets, past towering statues of long-forgotten heroes and intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story. Every corner of the city pulsed with a faint, rhythmic energy, a heartbeat of the past. The closer they got to the central dome, the more Ethan felt it. A strange pressure in the air, like the city itself was alive and aware. When they finally reached the entrance to the dome, the Guardians stepped aside. Ethan hesitated, glancing at Zyra. She met his gaze and nodded, her strength returning slightly now that they were here. Inside, the air was cooler, almost refreshing. The room was vast, its walls covered in glowing symbols that shifted and flowed like water. At the center was a large, circular platform, its surface perfectly smooth and humming with energy. Zyra took a step forward, then another. Ethan stayed close, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. Then, the platform lit up. The final truth. A shimmering figure appeared above the platform, a projection of an alien woman with features similar to Zyra's, though older and more regal. Her voice filled the chamber, soft yet commanding. "Welcome, heir of Solari," she said, looking directly at Zyra. Zyra fell to her knees, staring up at the figure. "Mother." Ethan's eyes widened. This was no ordinary projection. This was a recording from centuries past, a message left by Zyra's ancestor. "You carry the last spark of our bloodline," the projection continued. And with it, the power to restore what was lost. But you must be careful. The key you possess is not merely a gift. It is a burden, one that can shape the future or destroy it. Ethan stepped closer, his instincts on high alert. "What's she talking about?" he asked. Zyra didn't answer. She was transfixed, listening intently. The projection went on, explaining that the Celestial Gate, a massive artifact built by the Solari, could channel immense energy, enough to rebuild the galaxy's shattered worlds or to obliterate entire star systems. And Zyra, as the last living Solari of royal blood, was the only one who could activate it. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. This was bigger than anything he'd signed up for. He looked at Zyra, whose expression had turned from awe to fear. "You knew about this." She shook her head. "I knew I had power. I didn't know it could do this." The projection faded, leaving them in silence. A heavy choice. Ethan crossed his arms, his tone turning serious. "So let me get this straight. That gate thing out there, if you activate it, you could fix everything. But if you mess up, then I could destroy everything." Zyra finished, her voice trembling. The weight of her words hung in the air. Ethan could see it in her eyes. The doubt, the fear. And for the first time, he felt it too. They weren't just running from bounty hunters or hiding from warlords. They were caught in the middle of something much bigger than either of them. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Well, Princess, guess you've got a choice to make." Zyra met his gaze, her expression hardening. "No," she said. "We have a choice to make." Ethan smirked despite himself. "Fair enough," he said. "But I got a feeling it's not going to be that simple." And deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before their enemies came knocking again. The last stand. Humanity's fury unleashed, gathering the defenders. The winds of Velora Prime howled across the desert as a storm of ships approached Solari. The Exarathian warlords had come in force, their fleet blotting out the twin suns. They knew Xera was here. They knew what she could do. Ethan Carter stood at the gates of the ancient city, his arms crossed, watching the distant sky darken with enemy warships. Behind him, the crystal spires of Solari shimmered with energy as the city's ancient defenses began to awaken. He had never been one for grand speeches, but he knew the people here needed something to hold on to. "All right," he said, turning to face the small band of Solari warrior monks and desert nomads who had gathered. "We've got a big, ugly army heading our way, and they don't plan on leaving without a fight. But here's the thing. They're expecting us to run. They think we're scared. They think we're weak." Ethan paused, letting the moment hang in the air. "They don't know who they're messing with." The crowd murmured. The monks exchanged glances. The nomads clutched their weapons tighter. Ethan grinned, his trademark confidence shining through. "We're going to show them that this isn't just some dusty old ruin. This is a fortress. This is a home. And we're going to make sure they regret ever setting foot near it." The Exarathian onslaught. The first wave hit just as the suns dipped below the horizon, plunging the battlefield into an eerie twilight. Massive war machines rolled across the sands, their treads grinding the dunes into fine dust. Exarathian infantry poured from their dropships, clad in black armor that gleamed under the pale light of their hovering warships. Hover tanks and assault skiffs spread out, their cannons glowing with deadly energy. But Solari wasn't defenseless. As the Exarathians charged, the city's crystalline towers hummed to life, firing beams of light that cut through enemy ranks. Monks armed with ancient energy staves leaped into the fray, their movements swift and fluid, a deadly dance of combat. Nomads, using old but reliable projectile weapons, set up makeshift barricades and laid down suppressive fire. And Ethan was everywhere. He led a strike team through the chaos, cutting off enemy supply lines, planting charges on enemy armor, and directing the monks where their defenses were weakest. His blaster rifle never cooled, and his voice never wavered as he called out orders. But the Exarathians weren't easily stopped. They brought in siege walkers, towering machines armed with plasma cannons that could tear through the city's outer defenses. Ethan and his team managed to disable the first one with carefully placed explosives, but more followed. The inner gate breached. After hours of fighting, the outer perimeter was overrun. The enemy pushed through, their numbers overwhelming the defenders. The inner gate to the city was all that stood between the Exarathians and the central dome, the Celestial Gate. Ethan and Sarah stood on the steps of the gate, looking down at the enemy forces gathering for a final assault. Ethan's armor was scorched and dented, his blaster rifle's power cell nearly depleted. Sarah was pale, her hands trembling, but her violet eyes burned with determination. "They're going to break through," Sarah said, her voice tight. Ethan nodded, his jaw set. "Yeah, they are." Sarah turned to him. "If they reach the Celestial Gate, they'll force me to activate it. They'll destroy entire systems just to consolidate their power." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "Then we don't let them reach it. We hold this line." She hesitated. "You're asking people to die for something that isn't their fight." Ethan met her gaze. "It is their fight. You think these monks and nomads would be here if they didn't believe in you. You're not just a symbol, Sarah. You're hope, and hope is something worth fighting for." She looked at him, and for the first time, she seemed to understand. She nodded. "All right, let's do this." The last stand. The Exarathians came in waves. The defenders stood shoulder to shoulder, holding the line with everything they had. Ethan's voice rang out across the battlefield, rallying the troops, directing the monks to where the fight was fiercest, pulling wounded nomads back behind cover. The air was filled with the sounds of battle. Blaster fire, energy blasts, the roar of engines, the screams of the wounded. And then the warlord's dreadnought arrived. The massive ship descended over the battlefield, casting a shadow that swallowed the city. Its main cannon fired, blasting apart the inner gate's outer defenses. General Vokar, the leader of the Exarathian forces, marched at the head of a column of elite troops, his black armor glinting in the firelight. Ethan's team was forced to retreat to the steps of the Celestial Gate. Vokar's voice boomed across the battlefield. "Give me the girl," he demanded, his voice cold and commanding, "or I will raze this city to the ground." Sarah stepped forward, standing beside Ethan. She lifted her chin, defiance in her eyes. "You'll have to kill me first," she said. Vokar's expression didn't change. "That can be arranged." The final assault began, unleashing humanity's fury. Ethan fought like a man possessed. Every movement was calculated, every shot landed. He wasn't just fighting to survive, he was fighting to prove a point. The Exarathians might have numbers, technology, and power, but they didn't have the sheer, stubborn, unyielding spirit of a human who refused to back down. One by one, the elite troops fell. But Vokar wasn't done. He personally stepped into the fray, his massive energy blade humming with deadly power. Ethan faced him, his blaster empty, his body bruised and battered. But he didn't run. He stood his ground, raising a scavenged energy pike and charging at the warlord. The two clashed, a desperate, brutal fight that pushed both to their limits. Vokar was stronger, faster, and better armed. But Ethan had something else, the drive to protect something bigger than himself. Sarah's choice. While Ethan battled Vokar, Sarah stood before the Celestial Gate, her hands trembling as the ancient mechanism activated. She could feel its power, the immense energy waiting to be unleashed. She could destroy the Exarathians in a single moment, but the cost would be high. The energy would consume her. It would drain her completely. She looked back at Ethan, still fighting Vokar, refusing to give up. She saw the monks and nomads holding the line, giving everything they had. And she made her choice. With one final burst of strength, Sarah activated the Celestial Gate. The end of the battle. A blinding light erupted from the celestial gate, washing over the battlefield. The Exarathian forces were obliterated, their ships torn apart, their war machines reduced to ash. Ethan stumbled back as the light faded. The battlefield was silent. Zaira lay on the ground, her energy spent, her breathing shallow. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Zaira," he said softly, "you did it." She opened her eyes, a faint smile on her lips. "We did it." Ethan laughed quietly. "Yeah, we did." The surviving defenders gathered around them, battered but victorious. The warlord's army was broken. Solari had held its ground. Ethan looked up at the towering celestial gate, still glowing faintly. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if they had truly won. But for now, they had hope, and that was enough.